Okay, we're waiting, still waiting for a quorum of the master plan committee, but we're going to help the quorum out a little bit in a minute. The planning board, okay, we're on. Welcome to a joint meeting of the Milton Planning Board and the Milton Master Plan Committee. And I'm Alex Whiteside, the chairman of the planning board.
Emily Ennis, member of the Planning Board and Chairman of the Master Plan Committee.
Ed Duffy, Secretary of the Planning Board and member of the Planning Board.
Michael Kelly, member of the Planning Board.
John Cronin, Master Plan Committee.
Tabor Keeley, Master Plan Committee.
I'm Karina Milton with MAPC.
Bill Giesentiner, part of the consulting team.
Daphne Politis, Community Circle Consulting Team.
Brian Barber, part of the consulting team.
Jeff Max Titus, AECOM Consulting Team.
Martha Lyon, Landscape Architect, Consulting Team.
Paul Travis, Master Planning Committee.
Dick Burke, Master Plan Committee.
Brian Furrs, member of the Planning Board.
Bill Clark, Planning Director.
Okay, now, we're going to appoint a couple of members to the master plan committee, and let's take some nominations.
Mr. Chairman, the Master Plan Committee has two openings, and we would like to, I would suggest that the Planning Board appoint Brian Furrs to the Master Plan Committee and John Sheldon.
Okay, do we have a second? We do have a second. All right, and any discussion? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Congratulations, and you didn't even vote for yourself.
Mr. Sheldon, would you come up here? You just got voted in.
Perfect timing. Right on.
Now we have a quorum. This is excellent. Now, before I turn it over to Emily, one thing, I sent out a communication yesterday to the various members of the planning board and the master plan committee having to do with condominium zoning and asking, saying we should have a lively written discussion of condominium zoning, and it would be a good idea, but we do have a problem with the open meeting law, which says that our discussions, or the discussions of the master plan committee are supposed to be at meetings of the master plan committee, and the discussions of the planning board are supposed to be at a planning board meeting. So the email I sent out saying send in comments and share them with all your colleagues is no longer operative. I would like you to share your comments with me, the chairman of the master plan committee, and the consultant to the master plan committee, and don't share them with your colleagues or the other members of the planning board. And this is simply to avoid open meeting law issues. And what we will do is at the next meeting, all the material that has come in will be distributed. So that would seem to cover the topic. So, Mr. Cronin, you and I can continue to correspond, but we may not have the huge audience we were counting on. We won't have the huge audience we were counting on.
Can you, as the chairman, then forward?
Yes. What we'll do is we'll collect anything that's sent to us between meetings, put them in a big package, and distribute
Can
them.
you forward them electronically?
Yes, I can distribute them as a package.
You see, using an agent, I mean, if you send your comments to someone who then distributes them to the master plan committee, in general, if it's not part of the discussion packet for the next meeting, if you say, whoever, Bill Clark, would you distribute this to the master plan committee so it isn't from me, it's from you, that would probably be deemed a feint. F with an E.
But if you put them into a single package for distribution, it should be fine. So yes, I can collect everything. Daphne will collect what comes to her. Alex will collect what comes to him.
Right.
We'll put them all together and create a distribution package. And that way, everybody gets the information, but we're not running afoul of state law.
Okay?
That issue of when somebody hits reply all and it goes to 10 to 20 people, that's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah.
When you hit reply all, it only goes to one
Even
person.
though it would be nice to do, but we work within the law. We're a law-abiding group, what we try to be.
And another way would be if someone wants to send something to blind CC, so no one can hit reply all.
As long, you can, sometimes with blind CC, if they've done it incorrectly, it can still go reply
What's that?
all. But the point
That's
is,
good,
the discussion needs to be in
Oh,
the
okay.
open
In
public
the
meeting.
Okay.
So we will do it this way, and it'll make it
So
easier for all of
stewardess
us.
And signing, show one way.
Okay, now, so that covers the open meeting law.
Yes.
One other thing, our next meeting is going to be on Thursday, June 5th. And why, you may ask, because we are going to do some flood regulations which are necessary for people to continue to get flood insurance, and we're going to describe them in some detail, right?
Yes, we actually, our last meeting, we actually talked about this, and yes, the rules and regs have to be posted in the newspaper 15 days before. It has been noticed in today's paper, next week's paper, and that means we can meet on the 5th. The meeting shouldn't take that long. We're adding a new section to the rules and regs dealing with floodplain issues. It allows everybody who is in the floodplain that has national flood insurance that they continue to stay within the program. This is due to the new firm maps, the flood insurance rate maps. And then the last section would be adding the appendix that we were discussing at the last meeting dealing with roadway section.
Roadway
Section, thank you, cross-section.
Okay, so that's it for me.
Okay, so for the master, we're going to kick off the housing workshop in a minute for the master plan committee. Our next regularly scheduled meeting is Tuesday, the 27th. We'll be talking there. You'll see that there's an agenda item here at the end of the housing workshop about preparation for the Housing and Neighborhoods Roundtable. We're probably mostly going to be discussing that on Tuesday, maybe a little bit today. And then we are, of course, getting set for our June 11th Housing and Neighborhoods Workshop. So this meeting with, the joint meeting with the planning board is to primarily focus on the topic of housing in Milton. This is something that, as we've gone through the master plan process, is clearly coming out as one of the hot issues for this master plan. Housing in general, types of housing, who's living here, who do we want to live here, what are the barriers, what do we need to look at as we go forward in the town with housing. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Daphne and her team. She's going to lead us through the workshop, I think starting with a presentation. And then after the presentation, we will be kicking off our portion of the housing discussion, and that's going to lead us into the housing workshop on the 11th. And we are being broadcast live tonight, so it'll be good for members of the public to see what we're talking about in advance of that meeting. So Daphne, it's yours.
So as Emily said, this is in preparation for the Housing Roundtable, and what we'd like to do tonight is to go over what are some of the existing conditions of housing stock in Milton. What is the housing need as far as we can determine it based on demographics? And then what are some, and we have a stated goal that has come out of the process so far, and that stated goal is that people have repeated again and again that there is a need for a greater diversity of housing types. So we want to reaffirm that goal and discuss what does that really mean? Who is it for? Where should it be? What should it look like? And most of all, how will you get there? what kinds of policy options are there, and what's best for Milton? What can we all agree on? So that's kind of a tall order in the remaining time. This is just a start of the discussion, and we'd like to give some informational support to that discussion and share amongst ourselves some ideas about maybe things you think should be eliminated from the discussion because they're not going to work here, or things you think should be prioritized moving forward. So when we go to the roundtable where we have a larger group of people, we can have a set of priorities to discuss because there is a lot to cover. So we are going to proceed in 3 parts of the meeting. The first part, we're going to be very brief. Brian and I have prepared a presentation on housing in Milton, and we're just going to go through it very quickly. The main point of this presentation is to show you there are a lot of things to consider and a lot of options to think about. And the second part, which will be the bulk of the discussion, will be going over those options and thinking about their applicability in Milton. And then thirdly, we'll spend very little time starting the conversation about preparing for the roundtable, just so that we can have a head start, so that next week, or next meeting, we can, it is next week, I believe.
You mentioned everything's a draft.
Yes.
And
Brian is reminding me to mention that in preparing the materials, we did not in every case put the big draft stamp on them. Please just put it in your handwriting. Everything we prepared for tonight is a work in progress. We think of you as our partners in trying to make these accurate and correct and comprehensive. So everything for tonight is a draft. So why don't we begin? And Bill Clark told me this was going to be easy. So what do I push first? Yeah. Okay. So.
Just laser.
I'll just do this. So this is just to put it into context. We're in the midst of a master plan, and the main ideas are what are we preserving, what are we changing, what are the concerns, what are the improvements. Where are we in the process? We are now trying to figure out how to get there, but we're still tweaking where it is that we want to go, especially with regard to this housing issue. So far, we've developed these 7 goals for the master plan, and here we are on preserving housing in neighborhoods and providing a range of housing types. So existing housing. About 90% of the housing is single family. 82% of the housing units are owner occupied, and you see the average assessed value and the property tax. 3/4 of all housing units were constructed prior to 1960, so that means that some of them are in need of updating if they haven't been to date, and some might be in disrepair. Average home is 3 to 4 bedrooms, and only 4.5% of the housing stock is counted towards the state's definition of affordable housing and that 10% goal, something we will talk about later. It's okay, go. So the population, and we're talking now about housing need, we just talked about existing housing. It's projected to increase 3%. However, the number of households is projected to increase by 14%. Especially the number of seniors is expected to increase by an incredible amount by 2030, almost 90%. That's really significant. And family formation population is expected to increase 5% during that time. 1/3 of current residents could not afford to buy an average price home in Milton today. These are all helping us to think about what kind of need is there. Increasing number of smaller households, long waiting lists for elderly and disabled units for subsidized units, and many persons on waiting lists for senior housing in general, both affordable and market rate. We've talked about this regional housing trend overall, that both, the kind of a convergence between seniors and youth wanting smaller units in walkable centers for maybe a little bit of a different reason, but that housing type is certainly in demand. So what have we heard from Milton residents? Those were facts that we just covered. Now, We've heard people say Milton is a family-oriented residential community, that many seniors wish to stay in Milton, but would like different kinds of housing options. They'd like to downsize, they'd like it to be all on one level, or they'd like complete service condos where they don't have to think about lawns and all kinds of other maintenance issues. Young people who grew up in Milton are having a hard time finding housing, and a lack of workforce housing, people who work here that can't necessarily afford to live here. But all along, we hear people talking about a desire to protect the town character. Any changes that we make need to take that into consideration. Potential impacts of additional housing. The fiscal impact. The public schools are currently at capacity, and this will be a very important thinking about moving forward. But Brian also discovered, would you like to talk about the,
Yeah, we're basing a lot of this on projections made by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC. And this is a standard practice. Most cities and towns use these numbers because they're professionally prepared by professional demographers and economists and so forth. And one of the striking features that's very important is that there will be fewer people under the age 20 in the future than there are now, which means.
but in the far future, right?
Yeah, that's going out to 2020 and 2030. So that means there'll be less pressure on the schools. You can interpret that several ways. One is, well, let's use the capacity, to get the kind of housing we'd like to see, or let's just let it go and have that, have fewer children in our schools.
Well, or just know that there's a little bit of leeway.
Right. And also, you might want to take a much closer look at the MAPC projections to try and verify this. The same thing is true with that 86% increase in the number of seniors, 65 and over. That's a very big number. It's one of the largest we've encountered in our work in master planning around the Commonwealth. And it's an indication of the fact that there's very little out-migration from those age groups. In many other towns, people, when they get to be 65, a number of them leave. They go to Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, wherever. Apparently, that's not expected to be the case in Milton, and it's the kind of loyalty, hometown favoritism factor.
Or they go halftime, right?
Well, that's true. And then they have to declare where their residence is, and a lot of them would probably want to stay in Massachusetts for their residency. So anyway, the new factoid here, if you will, is the possible reduction in school-aged children that would free up some capacity, which is very important because the schools, as we all know, are right at capacity now.
The other potential impact to be cognizant of is the impacts on town character. So in moving forward, when we define parameters in creating new housing or in redeveloping existing, we want to think about defining those ways of mitigating the impacts on town character. So policy options for achieving a variety of housing types. As you can see, these are just some of the ways in which you can broaden the diversity of housing types. And we want to think about them, and we want to think about which ones, it's usually a combination, will help you to get to where you want to be. And in addition to policy options, there's also passing the CPA, the Community Preservation Act, and also having a place where other kinds of funds and grants can be funneled, and then the town, through its housing trust, can actually be a more active participant in the creation of this affordable housing. These are some additional ways about promoting accessory units, residential above retail, condo conversion, smaller units on large estates. There are a whole bunch of ways in which you can create a variety of housing types. Now, as we said, you have about 90% single family.
Did they put condos in those, or units in that second floor there?
Yes, that's in Bristol, Rhode Island. So, where's this additional housing gonna go? Here are some places where it can go, and we wanna think very closely about where you think it should be directed, where incentives should be provided to help direct it to locations where you think it's most appropriate. And when we talked earlier about the trends for seniors and young people at wanting smaller units, they also want it to be so they can walk to something. So that's something to think about. So what makes for a balanced community? A variety of housing options, usually as part of a balanced community. Supporting all ages, stages in the life cycle, and income levels. And I don't necessarily mean all income levels, but definitely a variety of income levels. Reusing existing housing stock. So housing stock will turn over, especially if alternatives exist for seniors, and then those houses can be used for families. And preserving town character, defining the parameters. On the right there is a drawing from the high school for the master plan. So how are we going to get there? How are we going to make these decisions? We want to review the housing facts about your existing conditions, housing need, consider precedents from other towns, consider the impacts, and study policy alternatives. Well, that's for later. That's when we talk about the housing roundtable. So, that's it. Since we have a lot to talk about, we thought we'd be very brief about the overview. Again, we want to reaffirm the goal. Is there anyone who would like to change the wording of the goal or disagree with the goal before we move forward? Because the goal is what we came out of. It came out of phase 1, and it came out of the phase 2 so far in all of our discussions, that there is a desire and an identified need for increasing the range of housing types. Are we all in agreement that that's what we're here to do, to talk about? You're wondering?
Okay. Why do we need to increase the housing type?
So, that's a good
I
starting
mean,
point.
there's a supply and a demand issue here.
Right, so that's a good starting point.
Just thinking about financial issues of a house, obviously if you have lots of houses that are available, the supply is great and the demand perhaps meets it, but the value goes down.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
Well, there are other factors that come into play, but when we're talking about variety of housing types, we did identify an existing need for seniors who now live in larger homes who'd like to downsize. So there's maybe a need for smaller units, whether they be in luxury condos or affordable units or in above retail.
And this is an expressed and demonstrated and substantiated request and need.
Well, how do you, I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, we have 8,000 single-family houses, some two-family, and they're selling very well. And there's about 300 of those turn over each year, and those sell out pretty well. But we have 1,000, almost 1,200 multifamily units, rentals at Milton Hill House, market condominiums at Bushwick Brook, senior preferred housing at Pine Brook Homes.
Winter Valley, probably.
Winter Valley.
14 units. Yeah, and they're all full. And
Well, actually, we have the number of on the waiting list for each of those. There's
But
There's a demand for.
there's a high occupancy on all those, and so there's a demand for that type of housing. We really don't know whether there should be more senior preferred housing or market condos, but we know that they're all doing well, and the demographers are telling us that there's older people and there's young people want to get in, they can't afford. So it looks like we should be exploring alternate types of housing.
Basically to facilitate the market.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Is that what we're saying?
Yeah,
I think
and
also facilitate the people in the town.
Yes.
Support the people's
Support them.
needs.
I mean, Winter
'Cause if you
Valley
see-
is full.
Yeah.
Well,
They don't-
Brian
they
actually,
don't have that.
Brian actually has all the numbers about how many are on the waiting list for each of those, and how long the wait is and all that. So that's a big indicator of need, if you see that people are lining up for it.
Well, another indicator of need is the developers that are lined up to do something, you know, because they've done their market studies.
Yeah, right. That would be the
Yeah.
market.
Yeah, they know that it's a strong market, and they would like to supply it.
Probably locally and regionally and nationally.
Right.
That's
yeah,
right,
Right.
that's right.
Mostly
And
any
also
open
the
house
de-
in the
the-
town is 10 to 15 people on a day coming. And most houses are going over asking price, if it's priced reasonable.
I think they got it.
In fact, the realtors are now putting a lower price on, expecting a bidding war.
And if you look at the demographics,
And they don't have to borrow money.
then, okay,
The next one, yeah.
okay, perfect, thank you.
And John, we know there isn't much room left. There aren't very many open tracts that are available for development.
Yeah.
It'd be hard pressed to find a location in your neighborhood to put a 40B, or in my neighborhood, or in precinct 1, or precinct 2, or
Yeah.
precinct 6. I mean, there's just not much place. There's a map in front of you that shows where the houses are and where the land that isn't available. And there's
Well, actually, Bill prepared this map. Maybe, Bill, you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, this is just showing in the colored various patterns, the multifamily housing. So it excludes single-family and two-family. So it's three-family, condos, and apartments. And it's just showing where they are in town.
And you have them by housing authority, by group residential, multifamily, three-family, condo, multi-use. I can't read that.
Pretty well dispersed.
And multi-use primarily residential. So you can see when we got further in talking about locations, you can see where they already exist.
Yeah, and the striking thing is that they're everywhere. There's not a lot of them, but they're all over town.
Right.
Unlike some other towns that have their multifamily clustered around commercial centers or whatever.
And there are only a couple of them that are within walking distance to the T or to a business district.
Yeah, that's
And it's unlikely, you know, this idea that we have to find places that are close to walking distance to shops and coffee shops. They're not. There are no locations that are within walking distance. So perhaps we have to be looking for places where you can walk to hiking trails or skiing or cross-country skiing. Because those are the
There's a
places
possibility.
that are available.
I just wanted to make one comment to respond to your comment about.
Housing
the-
specialist from MAPC.
My understanding is that Milton went through a housing production planning process last year that did a lengthy comprehensive housing needs and demand analysis, which might be something very useful to refer to in order to understand the community's housing needs, because I believe it involved a lot of community outreach and engagement, as well as demographic analysis. And the conclusions were that there are several underserved populations, be them senior or lower income households, and that there is unmet demand from those households that will be increasing according to MAPC projections, so.
And just so committee members know, that draft housing production plan and also the affordable housing plan of 2006 are both in the Dropbox folders that you all have access to. And if you don't have access to, let me know and I'll resend the link. I know you guys haven't seen it yet. I just sent it out this morning, so, but they're in there. And that does provide a lot of demographic information.
And as Karina says, that is, hundreds of pages of demonstrated need.
What we're seeing in the
But it was a very
business-
good question.
What we're seeing in the business, the last 4 houses that I've participated in selling, they're all two-parent homes with 1 to 1.5 child. And they're coming from the West Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, South Boston, the Dorchester, simply because now the child is of age going to school. They don't want to go through the Boston school system, so they want to come over to Milton. They're saving money on, instead of sending to a parochial school in Boston, which is anywhere between $4,000 to $7,000 a year, they would rather spend that extra money on a higher tax base in Milton. They're also saving on car insurance, they're saving on house insurance, they're saving on transportation, because now one of them is working in town. He can walk to the trolley to go to Ashbourne for, say, $5 a day, instead of taking the car in town. And the expense of the car, the maintenance of the car. So we have an influx of young people coming into the town, especially because of the school system. And we've proven that in the French program we have right now. There's a lottery system on every school, and that's completely maxed out. Fortunately, we have a lot of private schools in the area that a lot of the children go to. But if that ever came, the high school, either BC High, the CMs of area, and the Fonponds, the Notre Dames, Milton Academy, St. Agatha's, St. Mary's, if those children come into the school system, we're absolutely dead right now. That'll well over, I don't know what the population of these children, it has to be at least 1,000, I would think, that go to public, to go to private schools.
What is the percent of school-age children that go to Milton schools versus
So
not
it's-
attend?
It depends on the level, the age level. So the elementary school children is a higher percentage, then it drops off in the middle school and the high school. But since the new building construction program, that percentage has increased of attending the Milton Public Schools.
Do you
So
wanna
it's,
throw a number at
yeah,
it?
I think it's between 85 and 90, and it fluctuates.
Another way of looking at it is there are 8,000 homes that attract families. And of course, some of the people are seniors, but there's 8,000 homes, and there's 4,000 students at Milton Public School.
Right, 4,100 actually.
One for every 200.
No, 4,000, right.
Right, but of the 1.5 children that come demographically, according to, what's your name again?
Paul.
Paul, 80% of those are likely to attend Milton.
That's right.
I would say
20% will
90
go-
up until the 8th grade.
Yeah,
Until the eighth
to
grade, exactly.
substantiate Daphne's or,
Right.
projection.
Mhm.
That 1.5 children doesn't stay at 1.5 once they.
No,
get
it usually goes to
No.
2.5.
They drink the
That's
water.
like when they walk into town.
So.
I have when we say we want a variety of different housing types, as you know, the planning board is going to be introducing condominium zoning on August 1st. That's the drop dead date for the October warrant. And so we're going to have to determine what sort of need there is and for what sort of housing. I mean, we've got 4-story elevated buildings. Is that a housing type which we're going to encourage? Townhouse units, a different kind of condominium. You can have condominium units that are separate. You can have condominium units with 3-4 bedrooms. You can have condominium units with 2 bedrooms. You can have rental units. All these, I mean, these are a variety of housing types, and there undoubtedly is a need for some of them, or would be a demand. Whether or not there's a need is, defining what the need is more difficult than defining what the demand might be. I mean, you point out there are long waiting lists for affordable housing, but a fair amount of that are people coming from out of town. So, you know, it is a demand, but is it a local need? And so
And that's another question, right? How, do you decide that you're going to take part in this, what others have defined as a regional responsibility? Or do you decide that you're going to take care of your local needs first? Are you going to address 40B and get done with it as quickly as possible so that that is not over your heads? Or do you say, we're just so far from that anyway, and we have so many other needs, we're just going to take care of them, and some of that's going to count towards 40B and some of it's not, but that's what we're going to focus on. So these are questions that you have to decide on. These are things you have to think about. in addition to it.
And part of the purpose of this meeting is to educate all of us, and since it's being broadcast by extension, educate anybody who's watching. Part of the purpose of the meeting is to start to narrow down some of these questions so that they can be easily addressed by the public on June 11th, so we can get input that will help our process. And part of it is to start bringing these questions out that we don't yet have the data to address, but we should do after the public input comes in, after we'll start receiving the existing condition reports from the consultant team over the next couple of weeks. So these are general questions that nobody's expecting an answer to tonight, but that we need to bring up to start thinking of how we're going to address them as we move into actually producing the master plan and the implementation plan that goes with it.
Thank you, Emily, that was very important. So shall we talk about some of what Alex brought up? Is what kinds of housing do you see as being more compatible with the needs that we've brought up about seniors and young people who live here? What kinds do you see that are maybe not to be considered, or you think there's enough of it? Just from your sense of what you see and your own personal feelings and thoughts.
Has there been any attempt to reach out to the real estate community in this town who really has a better sense? I mean, I think I can guess pretty much what people may or may not want, are looking for in terms of housing, and why they come to Milton, why they don't come to Milton. But we're just guessing. This isn't what I do for a living. So I think that's, to me, would be a pretty good indication of they're dealing with this every day, as Paul is to a certain degree.
So Dick, that's a great point, and when we get to the end of the meeting, we have a list here of people that we've put together to invite to the roundtable.
Mhm.
And Brian has pointed out that he felt we were missing that real estate component. So we can brainstorm about who should we invite?
Well, I think so, because they're in this business every day. They're talking to people. They have some hard data that we really don't have. We can have a very subjective way of looking at it, saying one-off or anecdotal situations that someone didn't move to Hingham because we didn't have, 2 Starbucks as opposed to 1 Starbucks, things along those lines. But in terms of the housing types, what people are actually looking for, which really give us a better sense of what this is all about, and what Bill already has that.
Dick, I think you're right, and Emily and I were talking about your idea, and maybe of having a separate little workshop or conference with a group of professionals, such as Joe Cochran, who has built all kinds of a variety of different property, including Fuller Village. John Fish, Tom Cochran, is a single-family house builder. John Keith, who's built a lot of 40B type units, all the wind properties he's built. Rob Gatnick, who built the schoolhouse on River Street and used to work with Suffolk. Attorneys who are in that business like Ned Cochran and Bob Sheffield, I'm sure there are others. Realtors like Paul Durgan, that you suggested, is more in the Tabor's end of things with commercial, but Laura Cahill, Jonathan Keith, who's just marketed the Baker Square, and of course there's a lot of Milton people who've gone to Baker Square, and there are people who know about divorced dads and things like that I don't understand, but a small group of architects. We have 3 architects now, another one on the board, but I think we should have a few architects sit in on that type of a discussion, just to get input as to what's really going on out there, so that we're not stumbling off into the wrong direction. I mean, rentals might be something that we do need, and it's not in the proposed bylaw.
Well, there is no proposed bylaw yet.
Well, proposed idea for a bylaw.
The idea could include rentals if that's shown to be what's wanted.
Well, half of that Baker complex is rentals and half of it's condos, so I don't know. I'm willing to learn.
Is there anything in the proposed idea for the bylaw that would prohibit rentals? I mean, it's a form of ownership as a condominium. If they're all subdivided into condominiums, but there's only one owner of all 100 condominium units, What's to prevent them from renting?
No, as you know, we've embarked on this process trying to identify what the need is for condominium zoning, and condominium zoning, in my view, would include rental zoning. Same, I just mean it's simply the ownership rather than the type of unit, which differentiates a condo from a rental. So, it's open. We're looking to, we're looking for definite data. Lots of people feel lots of things, but we would like to proceed on something a little harder.
I think if planners could help facilitate that type of a discussion of researching.
There's two things. Alex's point to where and how is important, but one of the other things that the planning board is going, and what the demand is, one of the other things the planning board is going to need to know goes to that idea of preservation character. And it comes down to a question of, if we add more multifamily, do we want it right where you can see it directly from the street, as we've got in some parts of town, primarily down towards Central Avenue? Or are we going to want it set back from the street, sort of tucked in with open space around it, the way we've got in more rural parts of the town? And what's interesting is that we do have both in this town, so both can happen. But one of the things the planning board's going to need to know, and get input from this joint committee meeting, from the public workshop, and potentially from another joint committee meeting before August, is how do we see that those types of housing, so a different way of adding condominiums to the town, how do we see that happening? Because that will determine how we structure the design guidelines and the bylaw.
Well, I think the planning board has already led us in a direction to connect Milton Village with the Central Avenue and High Street and 131 Elliott Street, including one residential lot. That's going to be sort of our urban character there by the edge of the Neponset River. But I don't think we're going to do that between East Milton Square and Milton Village. I don't think there's any desire or any intent or appetite whatsoever to urbanize Adams Street. And, you know, nor between Unquity House and 131 Elliott Street, Henry's. And I don't think there's any desire to urbanize that. So I think pretty well you could draw a map and say where the limits are of that type of activity.
So actually, we had thought about, in terms of the roundtable, looking at locations by neighborhoods. And Brian prepared a draft map that we were going to show you a little bit later, that shows how the census, there are 5 census tracts, and they pretty much correspond to the five neighborhoods. And so using that census tract data, we can also try to see who lives there, and maybe determine the character by some of the data. And then maybe the decision is that it isn't, just like Emily said, the variety already exists, maybe it continues to exist. So maybe it's more appropriate in some locations for it to be set back, and more appropriate in other locations for it not to be. And so that's something that we need to look at.
I might add, the Urban Lands Institute helped develop that concept of connecting Central Avenue with the Milton Village.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They certified it, so.
Any other thoughts on rentals?
I think one of the questions you almost have to ask is, do you want to attract young people to come into and live in the town, and provide opportunities for elderly people to stay in the town? And that's what I would think rentals would be all about. I've heard, once again, anecdotal stories of a friend of mine just the other day selling a house, and said, I have a house in Situate, I have a house in Florida, I don't want a third house, but I would like to rent something, which she was able to find. I'm not sure if that's the case, but I think that, I know there's awful lot of young kids renting in Quincy, for example. If we had housing stock available in Milton, and in the rental side, would that be something that would be attractive to the town and to them?
How young do you mean? Do you mean young married, or do you mean young single?
21 to 30, married, single.
I don't think the single ones.
They want to live in Quincy. Or it's
They-
more
It's
They
more
want
popular.
urban and
They want South,
clubs and,
they're actually,
happening.
there's nothing in South Boston for rent right now. They're talking $2,500 to $3,000 in South Boston. There's an article in the Globe, I believe, last week, of over in Chelsea, the old wallpaper factory over in Chelsea, and that is, you might know that it's 75% occupied already by young urban kids that want to go in town, work in town, high-tech in town, and Chelsea, no one wanted to go there 5, 10 years ago.
Right, that's great.
Nobody. My son's age group, they all went to South Boston, now they're moving, nothing in South Boston, they're moving to Roxbury, they're moving to Dorchester. They don't want Milton because there's no nightlife.
it seems like the youngest group that wants to move to Milton is what you described earlier.
The 32.
People have been married for a couple of years, now they have a kid, and,
They want parking
South Boston,
space.
and no parking space, and no front yard, and
And they want the good school, they're getting ready for the good school
Although the
system.
new one on Elliott Street, the Sullivan project, I don't know, I believe there's already a waiting list.
Milton Hill House, the new Milton.
Milton Hill House.
Yeah.
And it's primarily people in there going to Florida for Christmas till May, and they want a place to hang their hat, because they're close to the children around here and everything else. And Milton Hill House, I don't think there's very few young people living in Milton Hill House. If there's a-
Okay, we solved that problem, but how about on the back end? Do you think there is a need for anyone, you know,
Milton
60,
Hill House.
60?
Milton
yeah.
House is full
Yes,
of older,
right.
older
Yeah.
people already.
the demographics that were discussed earlier kind of indicated that that was the case, that, I know I'm getting a little older, and if there's no place in Milton that's attractive to move to, I think what happens is a lot of people stay in their houses longer, and that doesn't open up the real estate market to available.
So would we agree that there is a need for something like that on the rental
I
side?
would.
And not all of them want to be in an organized senior center like Fuller or
Right.
Winter Valley.
Okay, we solved that one.
I mean, 88 Wharf Cruise, that's,
Yeah,
majority.
right.
88 Wharf is
88 Wharf is
elderly.
luxury. I mean, it's high rent, there's high condo prices.
And also there are indications that as the baby boomer population ages, they want less of that senior life. It's sort of want more integration with the community, more multi-generational, and more interested in socializing and wellness rather than in kind of the senior center life. And even senior centers are going to have to reinvent themselves and the services they provide. So I think, as we're saying, there's a large senior population coming, and there's going to be a variety of needs. It's not going to just be one size fits all. So we need to think about what those are. And the last time we attended the planning board meeting, there was a discussion about making age-restricted housing not by restriction, but by design. So you make the architecture more appealing to someone of an older age. My mother happens to live in a place like this where the master bedroom is on the first floor, and then there are other bedrooms up there in case they're needed. So it's more likely for someone who's senior to live there.
I think location would help accomplish that.
Yes.
I mean, if you build a market rate condominium development on an estate, and it's set way back off the road, and it's got a little, landscaping around it, it's more attractive to somebody who wants to say, I want to live there 6 months and 6 months in Florida, and I would like to stay in Milton, as opposed to like the young people we've talked about, or even the young couples and stuff. I think that's going to be less attractive to that type of generation.
So you're also bringing up the idea of using the estates. And we talked about there are other communities that do that, so we're looking at some of their bylaws and how they can be adapted. And one of them that, Brian, I think you haven't looked at, but you're thinking of looking at is Brookline.
Well, yeah, Brookline was one of the first communities to experience the breaking up of estates. And the classic case is Fisher Hill. You've probably all heard of it, where they were very careful, mainly through a negotiation process, and produced a high-quality product, keeping the original grounds and buildings from the old Fisher family, and building some newer condos on the property, but that fit right in. And so some towns have adopted bylaws now to try and make that happen either by right or by special permit through a negotiation process. One of the bylaws we're looking at is in the town of Ipswich, where they have something called the Great Estates provision in their zoning. And we'll as John mentions, it's our job as consultants to sort of bring to the table the kinds of provisions without, writing them. That's the planning board's job to write the detailed provisions. But we will continue to do that. And some of the material that's been distributed is a start in that direction, identifying towns that are thought to have decent inclusionary zoning bylaws with a number of provisions that produce quality developments. Daphne and I attended last week a seminar on inclusionary zoning, and I heard some of the legal arguments that are given and the legal advice. And one is that you really do need to go on a voluntary basis rather than on a mandatory basis. I think there's only one community in Massachusetts, Cambridge, that makes inclusionary condos mandatory. All the others make it voluntary. And that gets around a sticky legal provision having to do with exactions, because, and that's a legal term for trying to get some payment from a developer or project proposer. Exactions are what cause subdivisions to require roads. Exactions are what towns that have imposed impact fees fall back on the law of exactions. And inclusionary zoning is just another one of those.
Maybe we should just take a step back and just give a brief definition of inclusionary zoning for the listening audience.
Where have we got it?
So, just to say that the inclusionary zoning would be to provide a bylaw that would help to stimulate the kind of housing that would be both profitable to the developer as well as provide some affordable units. And there are a broad variety of ways to do that. And some of the lessons learned by other communities, we try to summarize in this packet that you see here. And as Brian pointed out, if you just turn behind your agenda, you see that there's a matrix. This is a little too detailed to go through now, but something that you might want to look at comparing across communities, because you have to define, this is one of the things that is going to be very important for the planning board, to define what is affordability, what level of affordability, and what kinds of incentives you want to provide, and what are you going to be asking for in exchange for that.
There are actually several municipalities in the Commonwealth that
Could
have-
you
that
speak
have-
a little closer to the microphone so the people in the,
There are actually several municipalities within the Commonwealth that have mandatory inclusionary zoning policies, Boston, Cambridge, Arlington, and the legalese, if you will, is that the developer needs to benefit from compliance, from providing these affordable units, and usually that's offered via certain bonuses such as density. So that's sort of the legal tricky stuff.
And again, with regard to that, we talked a little bit about this at the planning board meeting. So in providing that density bonus, then you will be asking for something in return. And will you be asking that an affordable unit be provided on site, or affordable units be provided on site? Will you allow them to provide them off site? And or will you allow the developer to cash out, that is, pay you a certain fee that you come up with a an algorithm that comes up with that fee in lieu of, into an affordable housing trust. And then then you have to have the capacity to use that in a way that helps you create affordable housing. So one of the things that Brian and I noted was that in the communities where it was most successful, there was a housing coordinator. And Brian, you want to talk about your idea about having a half-time?
Yeah, so some towns, it's either a full-time employee who spends half of his time on housing issues, or somebody shared with another town, or somebody willing to work half-time. But because there's probably not enough in smaller towns to keep a housing coordinator fully occupied. But it's very useful to have one around, mainly for the continuity. Whenever you get involved in a negotiation process, it inevitably draws out, and it inevitably brings up other issues that have to be clarified and solved or resolved. And having this coordinator who really kind of serves as a facilitator to keep things moving and to keep everybody's eye on the end result, and to try and eliminate the chaff, the irrelevant things to.
Well, the other reason the housing coordinator is important is that it's much easier for someone in that position to ensure that these units be counted towards the state 10%, because they can be monitoring and making sure that the lottery system, that the state has certain requirements to help them to count for the 10%. So the housing coordinator takes that on as well. So that if you take the route that you are going to just be trying to fulfill your local housing needs, but you hope that some of these will count, that person will take that on. But there's another route, which is a new model, which is through regional cooperation. And the first towns to do this are the towns of Acton, Bedford, Concord, Lexington, Sudbury, and Weston. They got together and formed a regional housing services organization, an HSO. And the municipalities pay a membership fee, and that fee covers the cost for some of these services. So, and apparently DHCD is very interested in this and in helping other municipalities do so. And Hudson and Reading are already talking about it, and MAPC apparently is also helping and interested in that. Is that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we waive the 40B for a couple of years, want to do it?
I don't know, John, you're gonna have to negotiate that one.
Is it just sharing a director of housing, or is it sharing all maintenance services and everything, or?
It's sharing the monitoring, it's about the affordable housing piece, right? So it's sharing the monitoring of the lottery, who gets it, ensuring that it goes to people who actually need it, ensuring that people don't then sublet it or abuse it, ensuring that the deed is in perpetuity so that it continues to be counted. Because as the market rate housing increases, the denominator increases, and so your percentage decreases, right?
Every time there's a vacancy, they have to do the
Exactly.
lottery over.
The lottery over again. So that takes a lot of effort on the part of the town, and in a town that already has a lot of capacity issues.
Right, traditionally,
Right.
housing authorities have taken that on, and, I mean, they have enough on their plate, so it's a benefit to them too, to be able to have some outside people who are, independent, don't have a stake in what happens, particularly in the town, and have professional credentials in the field to be able to do this.
But it is, and housing authorities, some are great and do a nice job, and others are not great and do a terrible job. And so getting a competent person to do the lottery and do the selection and
Stay on top of it.
stay on top of it, but it costs some money. I mean, if you have affordable units that have to be monitored, a municipality has to pay some money. And so even if the developer is by inclusionary zoning with an incentive for the developer to produce the affordable units. Once they're produced, the town is going to have an expense. If they're in perpetuity, it's going to have an expense in perpetuity to pay for the administration of these units. It's not, it's an expense, and exactly how big an expense it might be, I don't know.
But apparently there are different models for that too. For, I think it's the Acton Housing Development Corporation. They're able to cover their expenses
In the Affordable Housing
in the
Trust?
Affordable Housing Trust. Mhm.
And I think one of the examples you sent mentioned that Habitat for Humanity was
Yes.
acting for one of the towns.
And they have, and I got in contact with them to ask them about Milton, and they sent their info. They, and also DHCD recently approved their vetting, because DHCD won't let just anybody do the monitoring. So Habitat for Humanity is now an approved agent. And so they would be someone that, I put their info in there in case, you know, you want to be calling tomorrow, I don't know.
Do you know who does ours?
Housing Authority.
Yeah, that's what I was.
You.
You.
Me.
Well, I was gonna
That's what that
suggest,
smile was for.
Well,
I was gonna
This
suggest
is
you become
great.
our housing coordinator.
So
but
we
I
don't
thought-
need a housing
No,
coordinator.
you're at
Well,
fault.
actually, I mean, that's one way of freeing up his time to do some of the other things that the master plan will be calling for.
It just is another employee, but we are getting an assistant to him who could do it.
And there's a new young executive director of the Housing Authority too.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've met him yet too.
Haven't met him yet, but.
But Bill, wasn't there a lack of applicants for the last lottery?
We had 6 people for 2 units, and I think that's 6 people that passed there was a financial piece that went with it. We had 6 people that applied, that made it through the final pieces. When the 2 units, and we're talking about 36 Central Ave, there's 2 affordables in that building. The developer hired the Milton Housing Authority to run the lottery system for them. Once they're in, upon sale, it would revert back that the Housing Authority would then conduct or could conduct the sale for future use. But there has to be a monitoring of that the letter has to go out once a year.
Once a year.
You're in that unit, is it still remaining to be a affordable unit? And that's my responsibility to write the letter.
And as I understand it, developers far prefer that someone else do all that. And sometimes it's their first time, they don't
Right.
want
Once
to be
they're done,
bothered
they're
with trying to.
done. They've
yeah.
sold the unit, they've sold the building, they're
No,
out.
no, I mean even the initial process. They really
they're
rather
looking
have
for
someone
somebody
else.
to do it because
Right.
that's not their expertise.
That's not their expertise and they're not interested in
Their expertise is to
it.
build the building.
Right.
Um,
So if the town can offer that, it's a way of
Right.
making it
Milton
happen.
Housing Authority didn't know how to work through the process. They partnered with the Hingham Housing Authority. They got the suggestion from DHCD, and that is how they did it the first time. If they did it a second time right now, because of the change in the Milton Housing Authority, I'm guessing they'd have to go back and have Hingham help them again. But that's only if the unit gets sold.
Gets sold, right.
Well, if it goes up for sale, because one of the problems with ownership housing is that if you don't find a qualified buyer, it gets sold to a market buyer and it's no longer affordable and it comes off the subsidized housing inventory. So you need and DHCD has a program called the Local Initiative Program,
Right.
and they have, even DHCD loses a fair number of units every year because of not being able to sell them within the appropriate time period. So it's very important to have a qualified housing administrator. If you do ownership housing, rental housing is the better way to deal with affordable housing. Not only does it count more on the inventory, but it's every year you income qualify the people who are renting, and so you don't end up with over-income people in your affordable units, as you may in ownership housing, because once an owner is selected, that owner can stay in the housing for as long as the owner wants, even if the owner gets a great job and starts making a ton of money.
But I did speak to a housing coordinator, I think it was the town of Grockton, and she said that she continually collected names so that in the case that that were to occur, she had a waiting list of people waiting. So that was part of her job description, so that that instance would be avoided.
That kind of plays into a question I was gonna ask. The 6 people who got to the final stage, do you have a number of how many people applied originally even?
I don't. Housing Authority does, I don't.
Daphne, I saw you just turned, so we usually try and wrap up our meetings around 9 o'clock, since we all have something to do the next day. So it's about 8:09 now, so just wanted to give you the warning, and I'll give you another warning at 1:45.
Yeah, because our backs are to the clock, it's
Exactly.
difficult. So if you just, if you want to turn, if you would, after the agenda, there's that matrix, then there are 2 pages. There's something then called Housing Workshop. The first page is a little bit of an overview from the PowerPoint, and then if you turn to the second page, at the top it says Meeting Housing Need. So here are just some of the tools that we mentioned. I don't know, would you like to talk about any of them?
I can offer some comments. So we've discussed inclusionary zoning a bit tonight, so I don't think there's that much to add. In terms of 40B, it sounds like a lot of you are familiar with that as a tool, but essentially if you are under the 10% state mandated threshold, then developers can apply to the Zoning Board of Appeals for comprehensive permits if they're developing affordable housing or developments with a certain percentage of affordable housing. And so if you meet, then you're more likely to have all of your development conform with your zoning ordinance.
And now, just to remind people that Milton is at 4.5%.
A mixed-use overlay district, is there a mixed-use overlay district already?
Not,
In Milton?
not in the usual sense.
So,
What is it?
well, it's a zoning district established through your ordinance that allows for a mix of uses, right? Commercial, retail, housing together in one district.
We allow that in our business district. It isn't, we don't call it an overlay, we call it a special permit.
Special permit.
But it is
In the
in
central.
effect an overlay.
And we've talked a little bit about demography and certain housing demands, and this can be a good way to meet some of those demands, particularly walkability, more urban culture, that perhaps younger householders or even senior householders who don't want the responsibility of driving everywhere might desire in Milton. Those are a couple I can speak to.
Thank you. Brian, do you want to talk about any?
Well, we've got to see Brian's maps.
Oh, you were interested in Brian's maps?
What is the 5 different districts?
Yes.
No,
Well, you can talk and I'll look for the maps.
The neighborhoods?
Yeah, I'll look for the maps while you talk.
Before 9, that's all.
I got them. Oh. Well, I'll pass them out, so everybody
Yeah,
gets one.
pass them out,
Yeah,
right,
all right.
yeah.
So you go ahead and talk. about
Yeah,
it.
right. Number one, we want to get your input on the names of the neighborhoods, because we use names that we found in common usage on the internet, but they may not be the names that people are used to and think of as being, in those neighborhoods. So, I mean, that's just a kind of housekeeping item to make sure.
And this is not in final graphic format either?
No,
just to,
no, this is a sort of hastily drawn map. But what we would like to do in the housing roundtable is get people, maybe even in breakout sessions by neighborhood, because we have the feeling that there are going to be differences in the neighborhoods as to housing preferences and the kinds of mixes of units that people would like to see, and maybe some of the housing tools that they would like to see applied. And I think that would be very instructive for the whole, overall process.
And for each of these neighborhoods, which are the census tracts, there is a sheet that is accompanying the map, and you'll see that the 5 neighborhoods are identified. There are 3 on the first side of the page, 2 on the second side, and there are some characteristics.
Yeah, and those are just maybe 20% of the total data that's available by neighborhood. So the Census Bureau has produced a pretty rich store of information at the census tract level that can be used to characterize the neighborhoods. This is just a sample.
And we will go through and select the most critical pieces. This was just to give you some example of what we were thinking, to see if you thought it was worth us going through the trouble of going through and selecting.
I think the one, I'll throw out this idea and see what people say to chime in. I think one of the problems that you will have is each census tract is covering multiple neighborhoods. So, looking at Milton Village, moving over to Columbine in particular, but you'll have to explain, I think.
The boundaries?
Well, not so much that, but explain to people that you're looking at a larger group census tract, because people will get a little bit confused. I like the idea of tying it to the census tract so you have the data.
Right.
But somebody will come up and say, but wait, my neighborhood is actually X and it's right there. So just be aware that that will happen. And
What is the purpose of this?
We were thinking about using it as a way of deciding which of the policy options to use in which, in different parts, because as we said, different parts of Milton have different characteristics, and the town character is not one thing. So we were going to try to use this to make some of those policy choices.
and also as a way of breaking out people during the housing
And the
workshop.
data is available for each of those pockets, so.
So it makes it handier. And then also, we talked about, like, in some instances, we might want the multifamily housing to be set back. Well, where would that be the case? And some, we might want it more integrated into the streetscape. Where would that be the case?
So I just want to make a comment about that. The Historical Commission has actually done a tremendous amount of work in Milton, inventorying the historic properties and also defining historic districts. And as you know, there's several National Register districts. The 88 Preservation Plan, I don't know if anybody's ever seen that. It's actually a really very, very well done document. But I think that it would be very important to involve them in any discussions about defining neighborhood character, because each of the areas that they've defined has a story to tell about it, and it has a certain physical character, and it has a social character as well. So to weave that into this, I think would be very important.
Martha, from the top of your head, does any of this align boundary-wise?
I would have to study this a little bit more,
Okay.
so,
Yeah.
yeah. But, you know, Brush Hill, there's also Upper Canton Avenue, which is similar to Brush Hill, but there's probably some differences. Those
Right.
are two different,
Upper
historic
Canton
districts.
Avenue is in the Brush Hill.
In the district?
It's in the big Brush Hill map
here,
that Brian just
Yeah.
did, so it's,
So, but I think it's actually a different, historic, they defined it as a different
it is,
district.
but it just,
Yeah.
it happens to fall in.
To fall within?
Actually, almost all the undeveloped land falls into that Brush Hill.
Yeah, so I think they would be really valuable at trying to help define the character, and when you're going forward with coming up with guidelines or design guidelines for what type of housing works in what places and what it should look like, they would be really helpful.
That's a very good point, Martha.
They're really, really far along, and they're thinking, just, you know, compared to most communities in Massachusetts that I've worked in anyway.
We should ask, one of our members is actually also, is a liaison from the Historic Commission. We should ask him to ask his fellow committee members to make sure that they
Good
come to the
point.
housing neighborhood.
Good point.
I'm also going to be circulating the historic and cultural resources inventory tomorrow, so I can make sure that they all got that as well.
So it seems as though we've sort of slipped into the discussion of the roundtable, but we can either slip out or just continue on. What would you like to do? In a way, we could do parallel, right? We'd say.
Parallel, I think, works.
Okay, so what do we want to be discussing with the public? What do we need to tell the public and the people we invite to the roundtables? What kind of informational supports do you think they will need based on our discussion here and based on what you felt you maybe needed more of in the discussion, less of? And what kinds of questions do you think we should be asking? I mean, the things that have come up so far have been things like, who is this housing going to be for? Where is it going to be? What should it look like? We also, in other contexts and other forums, we've talked about looking at the neighborhoods and looking at what other kinds of things should happen there. Is there equal access to recreation and open space? Is there a need for some commercial cluster in the neighborhoods? Are there some non-conforming uses that need to be looked at and updated? So those are some of the things we've talked about so far. What are your thoughts about what we should talk about moving forward?
I think the elephant in the room is the 40B, and it's the only reason that anybody's gonna be at all motivated to change zoning.
Okay.
Because if you don't, then anybody can, use the 40B until you're at the 10%. So I think there's an awful lot of misconception going around town about what 40B consists of, and also, how do you meet that 10%? And I know Alex just mentioned, well, rental counts more than
Right.
ownership.
Right.
Huh?
Right.
And they're both houses, what's the
Right,
difference?
right.
So I think there's a lot of that kind of thing, that if it were, and it's
So like
not
a
easy.
40B fact
Cheat
sheet.
sheet, yeah, if we could all look at that and say, the reason is, and this is how you count it, and some of these things are in perpetuity, but for instance, one of these is expiring this year. So what, are we taking, a couple steps forward and then losing 40B units or affordable units at some point, so that we're gonna have even more to make up?
More to make up.
Where do we stand on that, and how is it possible to get to that 10%? Is it possible?
Is it possible? So,
Strategy.
right, but also, we need to step back even further from that and say, is that the only goal, is meeting 40B? Or if we look at the housing need as we identified it, are there other housing needs that we should be looking at?
I think the problem is that people look at what we're discussing here and they just push it aside because they're really focusing on the 40B, even if they're not talking about it. That's what they're focused on. I think we gotta get that out of the way.
Okay, get it out of the way first.
So that we
All
will
right.
focus on what we need.
I think a realistic point is it attainable? I mean, how many units of 40B right now? Do we
Brian, you have that.
426.
I'm sorry?
426.
426,
As
and
of-
we're not
as
even,
of 20.
It's almost 490,
we're not even halfway there.
if there's some pending
I think we
application
have it here.
from Fuller Village for the balance of their units
Yeah, it's right
with
here.
the state right now that they're evaluating, if they get approved, we'll be exactly at halfway.
Halfway.
So if you
so
look,
we
if
need
you go
another
to the
400.
last page
Yeah, so
of
we're
the
looking- we're looking at the-
definition of affordable housing handout, the last page,
It would seem to me that you gotta look at the housing that's needed, and I understand absolutely what you're saying, it's very key to a lot of people. But in reality, what goes on here is we have to look at the housing that's needed and just work with the 40B as best we can, because I don't think you can have a 40B plan that projects that we're gonna get to this 10% in any place in the near future. It's just, I mean, we don't build 400 units
so I think.
in 20 years.
See, I think what you just said is a very important starting point. Is that, does everyone here agree that that's the starting point?
That is not,
To say it's not
Near-term
achievable, we
attainable.
have these other housing needs, and should we just go for meeting those housing needs and see what we can do about counting towards?
how many developers are gonna come to the town of Milton and buy an estate piece of property that nobody's gonna give to them, and then go to the state and say, I wanna put up all kind of affordable housing here?
A lot.
Yeah, I mean, North Andover, they're putting in a huge 40B development in an old.
And then the state's gonna let them put up high-rises and overpopulate the land?
I mean,
I mean, they'd have to, the real estate in Milton is not cheap. I mean, you have to make money. I mean,
Right.
the developer's first concern is not to make everybody in Milton happy and not to make everything beautiful, is to make money.
Although
But isn't-
sometimes those go together, and,
Yes,
you know.
Isn't the whole
foundation of 40B based on how much profit you can make anyway? Isn't that controlled as well?
That's controlled,
Right,
whereas
so-
inclusionary
so a
zoning, it's not
developer-
controlled.
He's not gonna lose, but he's not gonna make a lot.
Yes, it's already, 2 steps out of the block. I stated that wrong. They're already starting behind when they decide to go with a 40B development. They're not going to make, this is my opinion.
I agree.
As much profit.
I agree.
As if they just simply disregard all of the regulations and say, this is what I'm gonna do, and work with existing zoning regulations.
I agree.
And bypass it. I mean, just as we are encumbered by the regulations that have been put on us to try to deal with it, maybe there's a time to sort of ignore them, but to supersede them and say, I'll work around them.
Has the town decided what the town's responsibility is in participating in this whole affordable housing dialogue? It seems to me that we could either say that we'll provide affordable housing, we're looking to providing for people who are current residents of the town, or as Daphne said earlier, we're part of a regional responsibility plan. And I think that's where we sort of have to start from as to what are we really trying to do with this whole affordable housing issue.
Where's the
All the other
starting
stuff, all
point?
this other stuff will fall after it.
I think this housing production plan is supposed to display that the town of Milton is making a good faith effort.
Right.
That's right.
But even if, you took outside people to come into the town of Milton and said, can Milton get to 10% in 4 or 5 years?
But
They'd
the
say,
10% is, I think, is secondary. What do we, the last time they had a ballot initiative, the town voted 65% to uphold 40B. The town had a chance. It carried every precinct, so I'm gonna guess that most of the people who thought about voting thought about that 40B was a good idea. I guess what I'm trying to drill down into, what are we trying to do? What is the town's responsibility, and who are we looking to provide affordable housing for? And I think you'd get a different view from different people, but I think that until we start from that.
Until we define the starting point.
Exactly.
Right, and what's the goal?
So then I think partly to answer that, we need to, at this public forum, we need to present the information from MAPC's 2020 to say, this is what the regional projections for housing need are. This is what we're looking at for our town. What do you, as the people giving input, think about this? Because if we're going to try and help out with the regional need, we're gonna have to produce a lot more housing potentially than we may have to do if we're just trying to meet Milton's own needs.
In a different type of housing.
And
And a
different
different
type.
type of housing, absolutely. And in some cases, we may not, because of how much land we actually have available for developing housing, certainly under current zoning, possibly with 40B, we may not be able to fully participate in creating regional housing at the level that we might be expected to. So how are we going to deal with this? I think you're absolutely right. We need to get input into this and to how the town thinks about that.
Right.
And
Because
the
it'll be
other thing is
increasing
that it's
pressure.
sort of, that it's a little bit of an unstated here tonight, is that, in every town there are fears about affordable housing. And every town has a little bit of a different edge to this fear. So, as someone has pointed out, in Milton, if you create affordable housing, there may be people who are afraid that there are going to be people coming that don't look like them, don't talk like them, and they don't know who these people are from another town, another city. There are other suburbs where that fear is less so because of where they are located. Well, it turns out that the Milton Housing Authority, Brian, you might want to tell the story about how they give the housing, what the
Oh, yeah,
parameters
no,
are.
they.
So I think that's important for people to know.
Yeah, as a background information, preference is given in the units they own. Which is not a lot of units, it's about 40 senior units and 12 family units. But in those units, they give preference to, number one, veterans, and number two, town residents, and number three, people who work in Milton but could live anywhere.
So that's something that can be done.
Right.
And it's something that's important. I think it's important to talk about fears, and it's important to talk about ways of mitigating them.
I don't think people that even fear 40B in the town of Milton fear people. I think they fear.
You think they feel structures?
They fear the structure and the sense of the town.
The
I
density
mean,
is.
the density, exactly,
Ruins
exactly.
character.
So the
I
character-
prefer, I'd make it simple, I prefer Randolph Ave in Milton to Randolph Ave in Randolph.
Yeah.
I prefer Adam Street in Quincy, Adam Street in Milton to Adam Street in Quincy. I prefer Adam Street in Milton to Adam Street in Dorchester. When you said other towns don't have that fear, it's a different situation when you're in Weston and you're surrounded by Westons.
Well, that's what I'm saying, right.
So that's why it's important to define what the physical character is of these areas, and,
And it's great to have a landscape architect on the team, and now someone from the Harvard School of Design to talk about how, the strategy to preserve the character of the town while we're doing work on housing. I mean, that's I think, critical for
it's really
the
critical.
new buildings to be successful.
Yeah.
And to have the town meeting vote for them.
I also think you have to explain to me what affordable housing is.
Right.
Yes.
People are scared. They left the city because housing, the elderly population especially. You know, I moved here so I wouldn't have to be next to Section 8s.
Which is a totally different thing.
Which is a totally
Right,
different
totally
thing.
different, right.
But people don't have
So
that knowledge.
starting off with defining affordable housing, defining 40B, and then giving a reasonable assessment as to what are the chances of actually meeting the 10%.
There are also good and bad examples of 40B.
Yeah,
Right.
great point.
And showing people
Nice.
what they fear, a
Right.
bad example.
They know
and-
that.
And, you know, some good examples of 40B would be a productive thing to do too.
Absolutely.
I think we
Why we're doing this condominium zoning in many respects is because the traditional zoning is developers are coming in and say to the AA area and say, 80,000 square feet, it makes more sense for me to do a 40B here than to build houses on 2 acres of land. It just doesn't make any sense. So we said we will come up with condominium zoning, which won't be as nearly as dense as 40B might be, although 40B can be very undense if the developer is so inclined. But the condominium zoning we're talking about is supposed to be sort of a way station in between what we have and what might happen without relieving some of the pressure. And we have to figure out what the balance is. I mean, how much pressure do we want to relieve, and in what way?
I think in determining that, it might be helpful to share just a few key demographic points in terms of the existing need that isn't projected, it isn't regional, it's not coming from people outside of Milton, but what's the cost burden here, the low income population here, the affordability gap now that needs to be filled. Might help people understand that, these are aging baby boomers who live in single family detached homes and maybe can't maintain them and need to scale down or else leave. So I think that might be an important framing to share with residents.
I think that's important framing. Just to understand Alex's point, though, are you suggesting that we bring up the condo zoning as a potential policy tool to discuss at the roundtable and explain?
Well, I think that if you do discuss it, it would be useful because this is going to, as I say, we're going to introduce zoning. Or we're going to slit our wrists.
No, I'd rather do the zoning, please.
We'll do the zoning, but it's not going to be at all easy, and the more input we get, the better. And anyone watching it who has a great idea, watching this discussion, should communicate with Bill Clark, just with their idea, and he will do the necessary to get it into the mix.
It is it is a tool that's already being talked about, and
Right.
so it should be
So it should
included
be
as one of the
included.
tools to test.
So let's go through and see what else we should, because we can't talk about everything, right? So let's see what else is of interest to you that we bring up that it would be useful and important to discuss. So, what about inclusionary zoning as a broader topic?
The must.
It's a must.
We just did this with the cluster zoning. The cluster zoning was inclusionary zoning that we just adopted.
But it was clear at town meeting that there was an appetite for further discussion, so we should add that.
Okay?
And it ties into the issue of affordability.
A lot of planners suggest 15%. Boston has 13%. I'm not sure if in the long run it's gonna make all that much difference, but it sort of is a symbolic step in the right direction.
Well, it costs money. The developer loses money on developing affordable units, and so rather than just saying 15% sounds like a good number, it seems to me that the financial data has to be crunched to come up with the fact that 15% is in fact a good number. 10% is what the state says. They want to see 10% of the housing stock affordable. They say, well, a new developer should produce more than 10% for whatever reason. I think the reason has to be stated, and it has to be feasible, and it has to be crunched by finances.
But at the end of a decade, the 10% is a wash, and you're not.
I personally don't think that there's any reasonable possibility that we are going to produce 500 affordable units by the end of the decade. But who knows?
We'll work on it a little bit?
Well, that's exactly right. We should produce affordable units just because it is a good idea to produce affordable units, but we shouldn't have somehow that magic 10% in front of us all the time, because it really is not reasonably attainable.
And that goes back to what Dick said.
To what Dick
is
said,
How do we sit here, what you said over here, do we sit here and try and say, our goal is to meet that 10% no matter what? Or do we sit here and say, what can we reasonably attain, and work that into our master plan?
Exactly.
And that
Is a really important question.
And we need to talk about it with the larger
Are
public.
we here to provide affordable housing for people who live in Milton? Is that the first goal?
That's the question you asked, that I think, I
Right.
just want to make sure you ask the question at the forum that Emily asked. Do we want to provide it for the region, or do we want to provide it?
From
I think the
Milton.
former would be the path of least resistance. I mean, if you're saying we're gonna provide affordable housing for maybe someone in this room, as opposed to talk about providing affordable housing for someone who might be 4 towns over. I mean, I think that's a reasonable discussion.
And also, what is driving our decision-making as a town? Is it the state's requirements? Is it projections from the state or from regional bodies? Is it projections from, how do we as a town make the decisions we need to make over the next 10 years? And what just to put in a plug for why we're doing this, what the master plan does is it won't necessarily tell the town, this is the final solution for everything that we're looking at. What it does is the implementation plan is going to give us the guidance we need to make these decisions over the next 10, 15, hopefully not longer than that years. We'll have updated it at that point. So how do we structure the questions that we have for the public, so we get the data we need so we can create that plan?
Here's maybe a thought. 90% of the intention should be, what does Milton need? Where should Milton go with the housing? And 10% of the discussion should be, how do we attain affordable housing?
There you go.
Can I take something under the back of
It's
Mike's?
taking too much of the topic and too much of the time and too much of the consideration. What does Milton want to do? What does Milton want to look like in 10 years?
Right.
Forget about, I don't mean forget about affordable housing.
put it
I mean,
on the
put
back,
aside for a
right.
second. Where does Milton want to go? And we'll take some affordable housing with us.
But I think the public deserves information in order to make that conclusion. And there is one tool that's available now, and I think it's becoming available for the members of the committee and the planning board to read. It's a 72-page consultant's report, which the select board has spent $20,000 to have this expert consultant, Karen Sonneberg, write a housing production plan draft for the planning board and for the board of selectmen. And it's chock full of very interesting information and ideas that the planning board and the selectmen are going to pick from in order to decide, and then they have to decide whether they want to adopt a plan, in fact. But it's a very worthwhile exercise. She's done 40 other towns, and I think when you get to read it, you'll really find it helpful.
I think that you have to go back and look at the document that John's talking about, and it's based on the affordable housing plan that the town did in 2006. And what's missing out of it is where. And to go back on the issue that Mike's saying and John's own comment, yes, the city of Boston has 13% provision, but they also have a buyout. They have a buyout that many, many, many developers pay into.
Most.
They have millions of dollars sitting in accounts, ready to take and develop the units. Their issue, where to develop the units. They don't know where to develop the units. If you go back and look at the last set of places that they looked at, all of their developable land is industrial. They're not willing to take their industrial and commercial land and put the housing over there. But then again, they're not looking to upset their neighborhoods either. So they have a huge pool of money ready to take and do more affordable housing. Where? And it becomes the same question that Milton needs to identify. Where? The whole issue with the reason that housing production plan is still a draft is where do we want to put this? So for everybody to talk about, oh, well, we want to have it, we should have it, we need this, where? Do you want it in your backyard? Are you willing to take and identify sites? It's where.
And John Cronin worked with Alan Bishop, the town's GIS expert. They did a great map. I have a copy of it sitting at home with just a few little tweaks left to it that shows where all the town-owned land is that might be available for the town to develop as affordable housing. There's not 500 units worth.
Right.
So as we think as a community about how we're going to address this, it is possible that the town could do some of its own developing on its own land. Most likely the units are going to be coming from private developers, and it goes back to Bill's question, and it's something we need to test at this workshop, is where.
And that goes back to the capacity, right? So then the
Yes.
town needs to have someone or some people dedicated to this task. And other ways that, we did start a list here that if you have a pool of money, you can develop affordable on town-owned parcels, purchase existing units and convert them.
Yes.
Subsidize units to make them more affordable, buy down market rate and make them deed restricted, acquire tax-taken land, purchase condos from the housing authority, and there's a whole list of other ways that once you have that pool of money, so some of it is not actually building it, but it's converting existing. So there are other, and there are many communities that do this in very creative ways, but it takes a lot of effort. And the important thing is to start from the beginning, talking to DHCD, making sure that they are in agreement with how you're proceeding, so that you might as well try to get on the list if you're going to make the effort.
So in Milton, at the housing, Affordable Housing Trust, which the selectmen board of selectmen have just recently appointed, and good members on it. But if they had money from people who had done the buyout on their, they could, as the housing authority has done, they buy two-family houses. And I think the housing authority has 6 two-family houses that they manage for moderate income residents. But if they bought a two-family house, the chances are that one of the 2 units were Section 8, so then they would become 2 affordable units, and Section 8 would be gone. So, you know, it's not the worst program. In fact, it's a good program for going forward. But we're not going forward. You know, we have these.
Well, there's no money.
There's
no money in the fund.
Well, that's right. We have a 2006 housing production plan that's just been updated for $5,000. And, you know, we still haven't really all read it.
It's in the Dropbox folder.
But-
Karina,
but-
Karina had some.
You don't need a housing production plan to create affordable housing. All you need is the will to do so.
Correct, right.
A housing production plan helps target that will and direct and guide that will. Just one quick comment about site selection. I think obviously it's very, very important and it would be a great exercise with the public as well as internally. I think another important thing is how you talk about what kind of housing development you're looking for sites for, affordable or not. There is housing demand. There's going to be more housing demand in Milton at a variety of income levels, and it doesn't all have to be these big housing developments with this 500 unit goal weighing on you. There's accessory dwellings and infill development, and that is just as important in site selection as looking at where a mixed-use district overlay might be.
And the other part of that too is transportation. I think that
Exactly.
when you're thinking about sites, you have to think about, I know there's a lot of desire for people to live in properties where they can walk to commercial or to public transportation. So that has to
And
be
so then
really-
that leads to, are we doing residential over retail?
Right.
Are we making these buffer zones around the business districts where there can be mixed use, where there can be accessory
and
units?
provide incentives
And
to do
providing
that.
incentives to do that.
I think you also have to
Help
look
us,
on
help us find those locations,
Yeah.
Martha.
We also need
Sorry,
a
John.
Help us
developer
find those locations.
or an entity that is going to, that will deal with them, that will oversee it.
Right.
A housing authority is not set up to be an affordable housing overseer. They have a different charge,
Yes, they do.
and watching the affordable housing for a town is not it. Having offered, we have money coming to the town through HUD, through the home program, and trying to give that money to the housing authority to go buy another unit. Their comment is, if somebody stops paying the rent, we have to keep maintaining the building, and therefore, we don't need more property. We need, it's not in their,
Jurisdiction, it's not in there what they do.
it's not what they do.
Right.
It would be
It's
nice
not
if
in
they
their mission.
could. Thank you. It's not in their mission to do that.
The other thing that we have to think about is affordable housing isn't just what's on the state's inventory. It's housing at different price points.
Right.
So if we look at something like accessory apartments, which has been brought up in the public forums before, or residential over retail, those may not count as affordable housing to the state, but they may be at a lower price point so that somebody feels comfortable buying in, whether it's a young family or somebody who's giving up a larger house. So it's affordable to them, but it's not affordable with a capital A under state rules. So that's
Well, and
something else
and
we
even
will
under
want to
state rules,
consider.
there are different levels, right? So you can see here, the definition of affordable housing on the table, there's 30% of median income, 50%, 60%, 80%, and you can even go to 120%. So, it's again, affordable to whom? Who are we talking about? And then making it affordable to them. But one thing about the will that Alex brought up, in this inclusionary zoning workshop that we attended, everyone agreed that it was very, very important for the Board of Selectmen to come together and publicly state their commitment to the provision of affordable housing and to define what they meant by that, what the level of affordability was, and who they were talking about, and that was a baseline before moving forward. So that's just something to think about.
Well, when we make our recommendation to the selectmen, we should formulate what that recommendation is going to be.
There you go.
Well, members of the Board of Selectmen have been very good about attending our roundtables.
Yes.
Not all of them at once and not all of them at every single one, but we should make a special effort to invite them to the housing one because they have a huge role in how this will develop over time. Yeah.
So why don't we, because now that is what we need to do, is go to the roundtable. Let's see what we've decided. We'll be talking about, do we want to provide affordable housing to the region or to Milton? What is 40B? How do you meet 10%? is it attainable? What's driving our decisions to provide affordable housing? Giving good and bad examples. Addressing the fears, and they seem to be around density, character, and I do think they're also about people. So I'm writing that in, because I have heard it. And then talking about key demographic needs, about people who actually live here today, the cost burden, the affordability gap, seniors, young people, and also what we've heard, what people have expressed. So it's both the qualitative and the quantitative. And then to talk about specific tools, the condo zoning, inclusionary zoning. We didn't talk about other tools, but we can make that list and circulate it amongst you. And then to go digging into where. And the capacity issues that Bill brought up and that we discussed, that's more of something that we need to deal with after the fact. Once we decide what it is that you want to do and how to do it, then we can figure out who should be doing it. So in terms of the where, what do you think about, I mean, this is all very drafty, but it was just an idea about taking the census tracts, defining them, and these are just very, I mean, we haven't taken the time, as we didn't want to until we got the go-ahead from you, to go through and choose what is most important about this information for each census tract, and then talk about defining the character of those tracts and how to preserve it, and what kinds of housing would be needed, and what kinds of policies would be most relevant to them, because they may be different depending on the location. So what do you think about that, or what else should we be asking the public in terms of the where? How do we, John, how do we lead the public to the where? I know this is something of interest to you. Where will these units be located? What kinds of questions do we ask the public, and what kind of information do we give them?
You know, one of the things.
This is a question that Bill Clark has drilled in on me for a long time. And Paul Sullivan left. The joke was that we didn't want to put the map out to the whole public because they could see where the open spaces were, and the developers would all go see those owners. And Bill's cautioning that based on some Situate experience. And I always commented, I said, well.
Rockport too.
Yeah, that's right.
I said, Paul Sullivan was a builder who was in the back of the room there throughout the early part of the meeting. I said he already knew where every space was. But I don't know whether you put out, whether you can come out and say the Carberry Estate or Henry Carr's 11 acres. You know, I don't know. I do think you could say that Brian's zone 5, Brush Hill, is the area most probably you'd find places for development.
I think that's very fair to say.
I think it's a factual matter, precinct 7, Paul Travers' business area, I don't think there's much.
There's nothing.
There's nothing there to develop in. I think the
Unless
same
you
thing is.
purchase,
Well, right.
purchase homes.
Purchase or
Yeah.
rezone to mixed use
Well,
in a
there's
larger
there's only
area.
a small part you can really mix use, maybe 1, maybe 2 streets. you
So
know.
that's something.
And of that, very few buildings.
But you have behind, in front of the gym,
Couldn't get you to name
the
it.
Randazzo
Karina.
properties, the 2 or 3 houses there.
But that's residential zone.
Residential zoning, so you'd have to
Right, so you have to
rezone.
modify. I think what Karina said is really important, and I just want to use this analogy. I do a lot of work in historic cemeteries as part of my practice, and I know cemetery is not a neighborhood, but in a way it is. It's like a little subdivision.
It's
It's
a sleep, it's a bedroom community.
Yeah, I hope you've all thought about this, by the way, because you don't want to do it at the last minute. But there are a
We're
lot
running out
of,
of space there too.
well, okay, so here
Oh,
you
no, we
go.
know, we
This
know.
is exactly what I was going to say.
Cremation.
So
It's gonna
many
save us.
towns or cemetery owners come to me and say, oh my goodness, we're running out of space, what are we gonna do? We have this historic cemetery, we need to buy more land. And the fact of the matter is there are so many creative ways you can go into historic cemetery and find alternative ways of accommodating new burials into old parts that are just so beautiful and so desirable. And they can be real moneymakers too. So the analogy is, this is something that could be applied to existing housing, existing commercial buildings, neighborhoods, that, maybe it's not one big development on an old estate, but it's broken up amongst a bunch of different things.
Scattered and off-site.
Like what Karina was saying.
Yeah, you brought up the idea of accessory apartments, and right now we allow in-law apartments, special permit, CBA, the apartment after when the house is sold, the apartment has to disappear, basically. You have to take it back to.
And even if that person leaves, right? Or
Yeah, I
in
believe
some
so.
way
and the
goes to
permit
Martha's
has to be
neighborhood.
reviewed every 3 years or something like that. It's been a while since I looked at it. So one of the questions we might want to talk about, one of the tools for adding additional housing is, do we want to allow accessory apartments on more of a permanent basis to be changed from what we have now? And if so, where in town would it be appropriate to do that? And accessory apartments at that point would not be limited to in-law apartments. Anybody could live there. We know there are a bunch of illegal apartments in Milton that, that goes around. I think there are in just about every community. Is this something that we want to address? Because it would allow for us to have housing at, an accessory apartment is obviously not going to be at the same rate that renting a single-family house is, or even a single-family condo. It would allow us to have housing at a lower price point. Is this something as a town we're even interested in?
And I know that not everyone is in agreement with this, but should we be asking, should there be residential above retail? And if so, where?
And thinking about, if you talk about that, you also have to talk about some of the consequences, and one of which would be, for example, if you put residential above retail in East Milton, you've got a parking issue. And we heard at our last roundtable, the mixed-use districts, that certainly the business owners in East Milton and the business owners in other parts of Milton are having real issues with parking right now. So how do those
So the
two things work
parking is an
together?
impact that would need to be mitigated, but the first
Exactly.
question is this desirable? Then we'd figure out
Yes.
how to deal
Yes.
with it.
I'm not sure that's the right order.
Right.
I think the order should be reversed.
So which order would you do it?
Solve the parking first. Create the parking space so that you could have the mixed use.
The mixed use?
Why not
But what if the
desirable? Because if it's not.
Because if it's not, then why would we?
Well, and
I
if
think
it's
you also
desirable,
look at
won't,
build
Right.
new commercial
Right.
district and put the residential on top of it.
That's what we're talking about,
But you're
right.
talking now, a different complete, you're talking Blue Hill Avenue section of the town, because that's the only place you could possibly have enough space to do something like that.
Well, that's the question. Where would it be? And if there's, where are the opportunities and what could we do to create
On
more?
Little Avenue in Milton is 1094 is the address, it's 2 acres, across from Curry College.
That's what I'm saying.
Those
If you
neighbors
build,
would, if you could just barely persuade them to have a convenience store and a dentist office next door, you'd never be able to have them have a residence on top of it. I mean,
I'm
that's,
talking the small one like they had, the yellow one you had
Right.
up there.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, people are destined, they're dying over there for some place to get a newspaper, a cup of coffee, pour milk.
Exactly. Just
There's no
kind of
place.
convenience.
that's,
And we're
that's
also
what I
talking
see
about
there, but
long-term.
I don't see it making it.
We're also
compounding
talking about
by right.
long-term. We're not talking necessarily about the people who live there now. We're talking about a long-term plan for the town in the future to accommodate the needs and desires in the future.
Jim Mullen lives there now, and I don't know when he's gonna move.
Then there's two questions from what just came up here, and that is it desirable to have living space over existing commercial? Is it desirable to add commercial
Yes.
space?
Right.
I think those are
Exact-
two big different questions.
Yes, agreed.
well, and there's a third question would be, is there a desire over the long term to convert the existing commercial you have today into a different format or
Right.
even a different structure through some sort of comprehensive plan?
Exactly. Oh,
And that would,
absolutely.
that would allow the development to solve the parking
Exactly.
problem.
And also, is it desirable to expand the business districts?
Right.
Oh,
Right.
oh,
Right.
Well,
But the reason.
Well, what's interesting
yes.
is you see,
Expand is this way.
Yeah,
it
expand
could be,
that way.
it could be that way. It could be
but
that
we,
way.
we talked a lot tonight, a lot of what we heard at the beginning anyway was about the need for access to transit, access to activity, access to social interaction.
Exactly.
We're in a community today that doesn't really promote that. We have, in many parts of the town, large acres, very little access to commercial. You have other areas that are much more dense and close to commercial. But if the trend is going to be going towards transit and social interaction and smaller, do we want our plan to reflect that, or are we going to be an alternative to that?
That's exactly the question.
And that is something that we all know, and probably most of the people listening in on this would know, is that something that has been coming up at planning board meetings, something that's been coming up at town meetings. Neither of those were the forum to resolve the question of commercial being in neighborhoods, whether it's existing commercial that's allowed to be there as of right as opposed to grandfather, so that people can invest in, whether it's allowed existing commercial in neighborhoods that's expanding, whether it's current business districts that's expanding, or whether it's new commercial. This is the forum, and this workshop coming up is the appropriate workshop to talk about that. So we are going to need to figure out, and I think since it is 2 minutes to 9, that we will continue that discussion at our meeting on Tuesday. But that's one of the other things that we're going to have to test. It's going to be a busy workshop.
So in the remaining 2 minutes, there are two things we wanted to say. One is that in the Dropbox, there's a lot more material. There's material with regard to bylaws. The state has a bylaw that's kind of a model bylaw that you can tweak. There are articles about, for example, architecture for senior housing, the trends for millennials and seniors to want these walkable communities and houses that are smaller. I mean, should Milton be a place for micro units? I don't know if you've been following that trend from the Japanese. So all sort of looking forward and exactly to Brian's point, what of this does Milton want to embrace, and what of this does Milton say, no, that's not Milton, that's just not us, we're different, we're going to be this way. And does that take care of your needs, being this way, whatever that is? So look at that some more, and so we can be all on the same page, if you will, or pages, because there are many of them in the Dropbox. The other thing is, we started a list some time ago of people to invite to the second and the third roundtable. We didn't have a chance tonight to go through that. We'll send that around and ask you to please add to it. What we need to know are who are the critical people? Paul and Dick have mentioned that we need some more, and I think over here too, some more commercial real estate people there. Residential, sorry, residential. I was looking at you and thinking.
And builders.
And builders.
And architects.
And architects. So we need to know names and contact info. And so we will be asking you for that, because we need to get the word out soon so they get it in their calendar.
So before we adjourn, first of all, I'd like to thank our consultant team. I'd like to thank all of you, and especially the planning board members, for joining us tonight. We'll meet again on the 27th, 7 o'clock. I think, Bill, are we back in here?
Yep.
Excellent. So we'll continue this conversation. Look forward to seeing everybody June 11th. And so I'll entertain a motion from a master plan committee member to adjourn the master plan. Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, I will entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting.
So moved.
For the planning board. We have a motion. We have a second. Do we have a discussion? No discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all.
We have the hard copy, so we'll pass.